Good morning. Okay. So I'll briefly cover the first part, and I'm going to turn it over to Ben. We're going to go tag team back and forth. But first, briefly, what we'll cover is some key budget concepts to start the discussion. There are a few additional views of information on revenues that we'll just point out for you. I know it was covered in the prior session, but we use that obviously in the budgeting process. So Ben will talk to that. Then we'll spend most of our time contrasting two different ways of doing the budgeting process between the Austin Community College and the Alamo colleges. So on key budget concepts, starting the ball here is the board authorize the budget. Each year, you approve an annual budget. It has to be available on our college and provided to the state on our websites. One key thing that overlays everything we do, just to ground what the budgeting process is about, is money follows mission. It's really allocating your funds to what's important, to what are the strategies that are mission critical. There's local policy decisions that as a board you determine in your policies, and that determines how much of your budget, if you have any budget that carries over year over year. For Alamo colleges, we have multi-year accounts such as construction, grants. Those unexpended amounts by policy would roll forward year to year, but most of our operating budget is annual. What is not spent just basically returns to your reserves at the end of each year. Distribution methodology is what we're going to focus most of our discussion on, to talk about two different ways of how you allocate your budget at your institution. And so that could be very detailed submissions of budgets, kind of bottoms up, overlaying strategies to that, or it could be a workload allocation method, which is what we do at Alamo that I'll be sharing. And then your policy would also determine whether at individual department levels, budget amounts can be moved between line items, such as how much is spent on materials, how much is spent on travel, what kind of flexibility there is during the year is set by policy. Contingencies. There can also be part of policy to have a small a balance that is set in the budget that is given to the chancellor or president some authority for changes during the year, there's a contingency there that would allow minor amounts of budget funding to be allocated without returning to the board. So that's a policy decision. And then you may have guidelines that are set to guide your budget development, such as what % of your operating budget is allocated to personnel and labor, or average class size, or other things that may be guidelines that are set that are framework for the budget. And then the last thing, you might have an account that is set up, a pool for specific strategic initiatives that may be temporary in nature to deploy a strategy. So as far as operational differences between Austin and Alamo, this kind of gives a snapshot, which budgets most of the time are based on how you're organized. How you manage is how you also allocate your funds to those departments to guide, provide the funding for the work. So at Austin Community College, they have a one college concept. So they have 10 campuses. They're not individually accredited. It's one accreditation across the district. They have one president or chief executive officer, one set of administrators, one set of department chairs, and then they can allocate their funds really functionally to all of those different groups. When you contrast that to Alamo colleges, there we have 5 colleges and 12 off-campus sites that support the 8-county service area. We are individually accredited colleges, and we are the only, in Texas, Dallas and Alamo are the only 2 that are like that. And so based on that, our structure has a chancellor, but it also has 5 presidents over each of our colleges. We also have 5 vice chancellors that align processes across our colleges, working at a district level, but then each college has 3 vice presidents that guide their academic, their student services, or their college services. 5 sets of department deans and chairs. So when we do resource allocation, we've got an organizational structure that's fairly complex, and that's another reason why we chose to do a workload allocation model, to do a fair distribution tied to workload. A couple other things just to set the stage. When we're working on budgets, we think long range. It's very important to bring to the board not just a single year snapshot, but start looking further out. What's our revenue stream looking like? So that when you're making a decision, you're contemplating what may happen in the future. On revenue estimate questions, we're also impacted by a broader scale than just what's happening at our institution. So we have to consider what's going on at the global, national, state economy. What might be the effect of state appropriations? Are tax revenues up or down? Other things that compete for funds at the state. So we're trying to predict what might be our portion that we'll have in the coming year. What is the taxing district appraised value outlook? What's going on with financial aid that might then impact enrollment? What's the political climate affecting these areas and anything else? So we're really trying to think much broader when we're coming out with our estimates. And then I wanted to also have a handy reference for you to understand the differences between our public universities in Texas and the funding and the community college. And the key difference is really for the public university, the state provides all the funds for their construction and their facilities and maintenance, where on community college, we're giving property tax authority, where we can set a property tax that funds all the operations, the people, the maintenance, as well as the actual construction. On education in general, we're both structured to supposedly have our tuition and fees set and subsidized by the state so they can remain low. That's why we're very concerned when the state has continued to lower the proportion that they fund us. And on health benefits, we do have a difference where the state still funds all of the employee health and retirement benefits for the public university. But as was mentioned in the prior, they've made a difference on how they treat community colleges now to have a 50% push down to us, which at Alamo made a $10 million in 1 year when that hit, that we had to absorb. And then you can see some of the other items there, a different proportion, but still the same. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben real quick to start through the revenues.
Thank you, Diane. Good morning. I think in the last several presentations, we've tried to explain generally the revenues, what we need from trustees. I think here we're going to say from a budget standpoint, how from a high level view, would like for trustees and ourselves to think about the budget. And as Diane said, is looking way down the road and say what going on today that we need to think about 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, but many years out, because there's it might look fine now, but with the compounding and things that some elements of the budget do, you could be heading towards a cliff and not see it if you don't look out far enough, or the effect of your policies down the road. Of course, we've already talked about challenging times, more students, a lot going on, and at least the state portion is declining. This slide, I believe you saw it in the last presentation, how the state appropriations bounce around. They tend to follow the state economy. They'll go up a little bit when the economy's good. They'll go back down when the economy's not so good. But if you do a trend analysis on this and say, okay, long range, where are we going with the state appropriations? And we sit around at ACC and talk about that. And by the way, these reports I'm going to show you to see the structure of it. I brought most of them with me, or the concepts of them from Tyler Junior College in 2002, and I had been there about 14 years. So, and I say that because we're classified by the co-board, I think, as big old community colleges, but these work just as well for the smaller colleges, if not better. So I would say this, regardless of the size of your institution, they all work about the same way. They all have the same accounting standards. So I found there's a few more zeros, but it's not really that different from a smaller college. But here you can see, and the red line is the one that's the most. It's from 2000 to 2030. Sorry, 2000 to 2030. And we just wanted to see where this includes contact hour growth in the state, as the population, more people go to the community college, but also it does not, the appropriations don't consider inflation. And so you put all that together, and by 2030, the purchasing power of the state appropriations is probably is not going to be very much. And I don't say that to be mean to the state or the legislature. We just need to know, or we think we need to know, and our trustees need to know where we're going when we make the short-term budget decisions. We're also considering the impact on the future and what are we going to do about it. A really important thing, and I think this really came home in 2008, 2009, is what can we do today when the sun's still shining that will mitigate problems next year and the years after that. Those are the type of things you want to be thinking about when you're preparing the budget as a board. You're thinking about the budget and the sustainability of your model into the future. What can you do now that'll make it easier down the road? This is the tax rate flexibility. This shows that you can see Alamo highlighted on there. They've got nearly 15 cents. We have a 9-cent tax rate at Austin Community College, plus a little bit for general obligation bonds, so it's about 10 cents. It fluctuates a little every year as the economy in Austin grows. So actually we have a low rate, but we have gone from like 50 million in 2002 to 150, almost 160 million in tax revenues, and that floats our boat. We've gone to about half of our total revenues are now coming from district taxes, which is really kind of nice. It sort of fills that void, but it's also, making up for declines in anything else and allows us to keep tuition fairly flat, in-district tuition anyway. Tax valuation, here's the big colleges in the state. You can see the 134 billion for Tarrant. It varies around Dallas, but the point here is all of the districts have different evaluations, different rates. One thing you like to look at is what tax revenue per student or per contact hour does our college get. But again, those are going to vary greatly across the 50 districts. Tuition and fees. There's a direct correlation that if you have low tax revenues, you have to have high tuition and fees, and the state's, getting lower and lower as a percentage of that each year. I actually put all 50 colleges on a graph one time and then arranged them in order, and that holds really true because there really isn't anything else, as you've heard well spoken before us. But if I do this every year, the Chronicle of Higher Education puts out an almanac, and I take that and key in certain figures from each state, the average annual tuition and fees for public junior colleges, public community colleges for every state, and you can see way over on the right, the orange color, forgive me, is where Texas is compared to the rest of the states in the country. So average annual tuition way on the left in New Hampshire is, you can see it's way up there, over $7,000. That's what the student pays. Texas is very low. It used to be second. California is the lowest because they subsidize. They're changing that, and they've already changed it a lot for the universities in California. But you can see still the cost for a year of community college in Texas is very low, which probably has a lot to do with how we're, you have tuition, you have district taxes that you can also go to. So I think it's a hard sell when you go to the legislature and say, we're starving, we can't make it. And say, well, wait a minute, Texas is far better off for annual tuition and fees than most any other state. But I think that's interesting information to know. As Diane said, we have a one college concept for ACC. We have 10 campuses, 2 more coming online pretty quick. As we expand the district, we've been very successful with annexations and voter support in this area. Travis County is pretty good to us, and other counties too, but Travis is the best. But we like to keep it simple. I think Diane will show you, if you have multiple colleges independently accredited and administrations at each one, that's a very different budgeting process than if you just see the college as one. We don't worry about the campuses, we worry about the programs. And we also at ACC take the master planning process very seriously, and that includes facilities master planning as well as master planning for the college as a whole. So we work real hard on that annually and update it, and then the board approves that. And then we also tie that into our budget process. The president works with the trustees and say, here's what we want to focus on as a college in this budget cycle and looking into the future. And then that guides the budget. The budgeting says, all right, everybody, we're going to focus on these three initiatives going down the road. If you throw it out to the departments and say, okay, y'all turn in your budget initiatives, then you'll have this very long list of things, and then it gets real confusing to winnow it down. So we went to this, all right, what's our top priorities as an institution the mission would have us do in our community? So that's that. So the board approves the budget and the master plan, and we try to link that. That's not an easy thing to do, but we try to have continuing operations and then master plan initiatives if in that economic cycle we can afford to move forward. If not, we say, okay, how do we get through this one and wait for the economy to pick up? We do have state initiatives, 60 by 30, as you've heard about and we'll hear about. We've also, seems like everyone in the country is doing the Guided Pathways Initiative. That can really transform how the college operates and where the resources go. And then your capital needs, and those vary widely by district. The way we present the process, we prepare the revenue estimates first. We put those out to the departments college-wide. So you got a top-down. Here's what we have to work with, but we ask the departments to build the budgets up by department level, and it comes up through the various instructional administration and the non-instructional. And so it comes up, it's top down, but it goes up through the various deans and with approvals at each stage, because that's a very safe way to do things, is bringing it up from the departments, look at your historical numbers for your current year and previous years, and that way you catch mistakes. Like, oh, I forgot to put in adjunct faculty salaries, or, all right, the number here doesn't look like it's going to cover what the number was actually last year. And you want to, that's where you have big budget problems. So it's very safe to build from the bottom up through the departments, because TQM, they know their operation the best, and you provide them with the historical data so they can see. And so it's a very distributed process. And it ends up where we have the president finally present that budget to the board, and the board approves or not. But it also includes a lot of initiatives that have been worked out before, at the beginning of the budget process, so there's not a whole lot left to do by the time it's presented to the board, and we do that over several months in components. Here's the revenue, is there any fee increases, tuition that we'd like the board to consider, and then here's the raises or not, various components over several months, and we approve in early July our budget. And that works out pretty well. July's a little early because a lot of times your taxes haven't even been certified then, but it's worked out pretty well. You can see that it goes through our system, and then eventually the trustees get it. Then we do this is another long-range chart, 2012 to 2030. We take it further out so we run out of paper. But you can see at the top, you have the revenues, the purple. It's just slightly ahead of expenses. And then on the revenue line is the summation of those bottom three lines where tuition, taxes, and state appropriations. And we hold state appropriations flat anymore, just so we're not saying, betting on something that it probably isn't going to happen. I think it's generally considered, and people who think about these things, that the state funding for community college is never going to return to what it was in the 60s and 70s when you had this explosive growth nationally in the community collegedom. So that's something, okay, now what do we do? But it helps you think about it. This is just a structure. This is ours. We keep it very simple, but our philosophy is we want the board to see and understand every single number of any kind in the district every month. And it starts with the budget, and then we produce monthly financial reports that are much the same format, because it's very important to us as administrators that we know what's going on and what's not. And then each month we plug in actuals as opposed to what we thought the budget would be, and then we take that and extend it out and on a prediction of what next year in August 31st is going to look like based on this month's activity. Tight budget control. We don't have policies that are tight. It's fairly flexible, but we want to know every day where we think the college is going, and if we have a budget problem brewing from anything internal or external. I mean, remember time the gas price, somebody tried to corner the market, or oil or something, and suddenly you have a big problem from an external source that's showing up in your numbers, but you want to spot that early and decide what you're going to do about it before it gets to be a big problem and have it solved. So this is a revenue thing. We show this to the board. It has all the components of it, and then on the right a little explanation for the trustees to see why is this number like it is, what changed. Enrollment went up 3%, or we expect it to go down a couple percent, but it's very clear, and these are on the website and everything. This is the expense side of the budget, and we take the previous approved budget, show the changes, and these items over here are things that over the time we've worked out with the trustees, the important key elements in the budget. They tend to get picked because salaries for full-time employees are going to be very steady across the board, whereas adjunct salaries and other types of expenses act differently. So in effect, we seasonally adjust our numbers every month and say, that's how we can predict this budget line acts like this, and so we can say by the end of next year, here's what that should look like. Our board, our budget is very policy driven, and when we say policy, we mean board policies. And I think ACC has an excellent set of financial policies, and we prepare the budget, and when the president presents the budget to the board, it better be according to board policy, and it is. But we take those policies and extend them out a pretty good ways till we run out of paper, so we can see the effect of those policies and its effect on tuition through all that time. The yellow line down there is, top line is in-district tuition. Right now that shows 0 increase in in-district tuition will be required to support our budget out through 2026. That's making some assumptions about appropriations, things of that nature. But this is how we present it to the board so they understand what's going on, what did go on, what is going on, and what we expect to be going on. And of course, we update it constantly as things change, actually occur and change over time. So that's sort of a summary. We'll be around later if you have any questions on that. I'll turn it over to Diane, and she'll show you how they do it at Alamo. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So our process is focused on aligning our budget to our strategic initiatives and to do a workload allocation that has a fair distribution of funds across our 5 individually accredited colleges. One's in the mix. But so we're going to focus on step 1 and step 2, what we do, but we really look at identifying, communicating the challenge, looking long range, as we've talked about. And then step 2 is really the core budget process that we're going to talk about. But I just wanted to allude to, once the budget is adopted, it's not all over, because you've now got strategies that you committed that you were going to do, and through project management of actually statusing how are we doing on that is a part of our overall model. And in addition, our 4th step is really looking at ongoing cycles of improvement. And so we won't spend as much time on that, but that is part of our overall model. So we start with the multi-year budget. This is a representation of the details as we roll it up to share. And similar to what Ben had suggested, we're modeling as kind of our worst case view is that we would get the same pool of money from the state to support a lot more growth. So otherwise, what we tell our departments is contact hour reimbursement, where they think you're going to get more money because you're growing a program. Actually, the contact hours are just used to compete with your peer 50 colleges on what proportion of a fixed pool of money the state decides to give us. So that's the reality. So we've started saying, you know, flat is the new growth for the state because that is about all that we could do. So here we've modeled it as a flat dollar amount, knowing that we're going to have a lot of, we were planning on growth. So we're actually losing money on a per student basis. And this shows the impact to everything else. So we've got demographic growth in San Antonio that's projected. So we do expect more students that we're serving. That's modeled out for the 10 years. We plan on what we might have to do in tuition based on if our state numbers come in that way. We've also been very benefited by tax valuations going up, so the same rate is producing more revenues. So that's helped us to invest in a lot of the strategic initiatives that we wanted to do. We moved to case management advising, added a whole lot of advisors, and we're implementing the pathways. That's a lot of upfront dollars to deploy those. And so luckily we've had the benefit of some of that tax revenue to help that. Then in investments, we're also have investments on preventive maintenance. That's keeping our buildings maintained. We have 5 million gross square feet of facilities and a huge list of deferred maintenance items. But we've been trying to ramp from really less than 8 years ago. We were at 0 in our operating budget every year to do this, and through our board has consciously stepped that up. So we're now at $14.5 million to maintain buildings that we're investing as part of our budget, and we really need to get to at least $21 million to stay ahead of the deterioration on the buildings. So that's planned in here. Capital equipment, knowing we've got expensive equipment in our classrooms and we need to continue to feed more money there so that when their lifetime is up, we had a major building campaign within the last 10 years, and so we know we're going to hit a point where all that equipment in new buildings, we're going to have a glut of expense. So we're trying to step up our capital funding to cover that. And then on things like energy, we know we have rate increases on utilities, but so far we've been able to produce energy savings through strategies each year that have mitigated our increases, so we've been able to stay pretty flat on the actual cost. And then we are still putting a lot more efficiencies in to cover all of these other costs. So these are the puts and takes. You can see that tax really ramped up recently through tax valuations, not the rate change necessarily. Tuition is mainly from the growth of the students as well as the rate, but the state getting from 35% down to 19% of our mix in the 10 years. Our second piece is really where we're going to spend the time of how we create our operating budget at the beginning of the year. We start with a workload allocation budget, and then on top of that, if there are strategies that are not in our baseline, they're not in our operations today, things that we are purposely putting more money in, like when we added a bunch of advisors, we would layer that on top to what we create on the workload. And so the key piece of our process, just like Ben mentioned, we start with our revenues. So we do all our projections on our main revenue, formula-based items of taxes, the state, tuition and fees, based on various scenarios of that. But then we also have non-formula revenue, and what we mean by that is each of our 5 colleges they have different programs, and we have certain programs, 28 of them that we've identified as high cost, high demand programs where we actually have a special program tuition. So if that college has that, then of course they would get the revenues added in their pool of money to cover the expenses that go with those programs. So it's not equal across the 5 colleges, which is why we call it non-formula. And then on the operating expense budget, what makes it different for us is we really do a very high-level workload allocation model, and I'm going to tell you what the key drivers are. What it does, it allocates a pool of money, basically, to each of the 5 colleges, as well as to the vice chancellor organizations, based on workload metrics. It's done in Excel. But it's very transparent. All of our budget officers at the college and district know every cell of that model. They know how their pool of money is set, and it's tied to things such as how many students, contact hours. And it allowed us to take some of our older colleges that maybe their growth wasn't as rapid as some of our new colleges, and make sure we have the money allocated in a fair process, so that those that are rapidly growing get the kind of funds they need, and those that may be shrinking are really going to have to be accountable to look at their operations and how they can shrink their cost over time. So the key of that is all of the math we do results in a single number for each college president, dollar amount for the year. Then step 2, we leave it decentralized to the experts that are closer to the operations. So each of the colleges has their pool of money, and they would do a process very similar to what Ben said, where they're working across all their departments, building these detail requests, and then they load it into our banner system, and we verify that the bottom line totals the total that they were allocated. But they can then decide what positions are most important, how much to spend on tutoring. We're not doing that at some district level. So that's how our process works. Then if we had any strategic initiatives, such as when we did the advising, then we have a distribution of that we add to the college's general pool number. I won't go through all these, but these are some of the key metrics that are within our model, and I know you have a copy of this presentation, I think, in a drive or somewhere online, so you'll be able to get to it. This one, I was going to spend just a couple minutes on it just so that you can get a flavor of what I mean by workload. So when we look at key drivers, it all starts with instruction. We're in the instruction business, so you got to start there. So we have projections from each of our colleges on what our contact hours are expected to be by each of the 28 disciplines programs. And so within that, we then calculate, well, then how many faculty do we need based on average class size assumptions that differ across those 28. And we even look at average class size differences between our labs versus our classrooms. So it's an agreed upon metric of what those average class size would be with our colleges. And with the board, they had charged us to net to an average class size of 25. That means some are running a lot smaller, some are running a lot larger, but that we look at the mix to get to 25. And that was a strategy that helped us save some money several years ago. So once we come up with the faculty, we costed out a district-wide salary average that uses a 50-50 ratio between adjunct and full-time. And then we looked at the other costs that support instruction, all of the other people that are part of your instructional support, but they're not the teachers. And we look at that based on our last audited financial statement, what a dollar per contact hour on average, what that relationship is, and we apply it to our projection in the current year of how many contact hours we have. So we're still all up here. So that started there. We know what our contact hours, we get our staffing, we forecast, we use our average other cost per contact hour. Once we get instruction, then academic support, we look at our history. Again, our district-wide average on what percent academic support is as a ratio to our instruction costs based on history of what we spend district-wide. And that's really important for us when we did this several years ago, because again, we didn't want to reward people that just happen to spend a lot more money, that they get more money, and those that are really trying to be frugal. By using district-wide averages, you kind of drive the behavior to really shrink some of those where we were maybe spending a lot more over time, have normalized because of this method. Student services, we have a ratio of 350 to 1, 350 students for each advisor that we've invested a lot of money in. And so we calculate what that is based on our student projections. And then we also do average cost per head count for just student services in general, all those other positions, your enrollment, et cetera. Institutional support is a ratio of institutional support cost district-wide as a ratio to all of those other 3 buckets prior. So again, it allows us, if you're projecting growth, to still continue to support that in all of these operations that need to be in relationship to your core, how much you're going to support. Institutional support at the district level for the vice chancellors is the same way. Well, we use the same workload methodology. The only thing is we also pick up all the restricted accounts, because for purchasing and AP, we're still purchasing and supporting all of that activity. So we look at as a percent what we spend of the total budget in relationship, so it builds the same. And then operations and maintenance, that's the facilities group. It is centralized, even though we may be co-located with the colleges at the campus to do housekeeping, grounds, maintenance of the building, utilities, but we have it all in one budget, and we use workload that's based on square footage or acreage that's relevant. And then also for utilities, we look at what the rate projection is and what our consumption is. So it's all these metrics that we calculate that result in the dollars. So when we put it all together, we end up with a dollar amount for each of our 5 vice chancellors and our colleges. And then the other couple things that we've added to the mix over the years is to encourage savings. We implemented a savings kind of part, that's part of our board policy on budgets, that we reserve any savings, net savings at the end of the year. 25% of that can be rolled over to the college. It's normally assigned at a presidential level or vice chancellor level. And then they can accumulate it, over several years. And that allows them, if they have some unique projects that they need a little pool of money, it encourages the savings and allows them to do that. The other 75% still moves into the fund balance, because those major strategies like advising, our pathways that benefit everybody, we still need a funding source. If we didn't spend it, it helps us to use some of that money in future year budgets. And then the last thing we talked about, we have been very focused on our strategic investments on such things in the student success area, but also operations and systems, tools and systems, and employee compensation for the raises and development costs. So our communication plan at Alamo is, because we do this workload model, and there's not as much visibility to this bottoms up, everybody engaging on it, then we do a lot more communication. So our chief budget officer at the district and the college budget officers and the vice chancellor, they meet every single month during the development as well as questions. We also have all-day retreats with the Board of Trustees. In November, we start our discussion for fiscal year 18, and then July is when we adopt it and have the final detailed review of the budget all day. And that now has a new step where every vice chancellor and president presents to the board what their achievements were for the prior year and what their goals are and where their money and priorities are, because they've done that detail allocation of that pool. And then we also hold some town halls on request at the colleges, where often the chief budget officer will go and just answer questions, discuss this methodology, so that all of our employees are more informed. And the budget book, which is published December 1st, is online. For the 6th year, we won the GFOA Distinguished Budget Presentation. I'd encourage you, if your college has not actually submitted for that, it's very helpful because it gives you a feedback report. It's a great communications tool. It looks at not just your required budget information, but it's a communication tool for everything, for debt, for a lot of the things within your realm, all your strategic investments, and it's very helpful for the general public as well as our employee base to have. And so I'd encourage you, if you do submit for that, you'll get some wonderful feedback to keep improving your process. And then the last slide, we'll be right on time, I think, is what do you need to consider planning and budgeting? Just to wrap up, some key questions that you as board members want to keep in mind is focus in. What's the budget policies that you have? Some of those things we alluded to up front. Do you want to allow movement between accounts? All those kind of things. Do you have a master plan that includes your facility needs? How often is the master plan and strategic plan updated? Is the budget tied to the master plan and strategic plan? How does the budget process work, which we've just talked about? What are long-range implications of today's decisions? Thinking beyond just the snapshot, because if you're adding people and you're thinking you're going to have your revenues dropping off, well, now you've got some embedded cost structure. So you really got to think about that. And then are the present practices fiscally sustainable long-term? So, and that was what we had for you today.
Thank you.